Hey there, welcome back. Today we're going to take a deep dive into something that's been a hot topic for years now, the origins of the COVID-19 pandemic. We've got we've got a massive 520-page report from a House of Representatives committee who dedicated 2 years to investigating this very thing. And let me tell you, this report doesn't hold back. We're about to unpack some explosive claims, including the possibility of a lab leak, some intense political clashes, and even a potential grand jury investigation.
Yeah, what's particularly noteworthy is that this report doesn't shy away from challenging the prevailing scientific thought. For a long time, the general consensus has been that the virus emerged naturally. But this House committee, they're putting forth a different theory. They believe COVID-19 likely originated from a lab leak.
Okay, so let's get into the nitty-gritty of this House report. You mentioned it challenges the mainstream view, but it's important to remember that this report comes from a committee with a Republican majority, and the Democrats on the panel weren't totally convinced. They had some reservations about the evidence.
Right. And it is important to acknowledge that the evidence presented doesn't offer a definitive smoking gun. What we see laid out is a sequence of events that, when taken together, raise serious questions about the possibility of a lab origin.
That's interesting. So even though there's no undeniable proof, the timeline itself is what's causing concern. That's kind of like a detective piecing together clues, isn't it? What else is in this report that makes it so controversial?
Well, this report goes beyond just the virus's origin. It levels criticism at various agencies and their handling of the pandemic. We're talking about the World Health Organization,
Yeah.
decisions on lockdowns, mask mandates, even how the vaccine approval process went down.
Wow, so they really went all in. Let's zoom in on that lab leak hypothesis for a minute. This report puts the Wuhan Institute of Virology, WIV, right in the spotlight.
And what adds another layer of complexity is that the report highlights a connection between WIV and the U.S. A nonprofit called EcoHealth Alliance was channeling funds from the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, or NIAID, to this Wuhan lab. These funds were specifically for research on bat coronaviruses. Now, NIAID was headed by Dr. Fauci at the time, so you can see how this adds fuel to the fire.
It sounds like there's a web of connections here. And you mentioned bat coronaviruses. This research wasn't just observing them in the wild, right?
You're right. The type of research being done at WIV is what's known as gain-of-function research. In simple terms, it involves manipulating viruses to study how they might evolve. This could mean making a virus more transmissible or even more deadly.
Okay, I'm starting to see why this is controversial. It sounds like there's a real risk involved in that kind of research. What if something goes wrong and a modified virus escapes?
That's precisely the concern. Gain-of-function research, while potentially valuable for understanding and preparing for future pandemics, carries inherent risks. If a modified virus were to escape a lab, the consequences could be catastrophic.
And the Democrats on the committee, what was their take on this?
They countered that the specific viruses being studied at WIV were too genetically different from SARS-CoV-2, the virus that causes COVID-19, to have been the direct cause of the pandemic. Their argument is that the genetic gap is just too big to make that leap.
So we've got this heated scientific debate about a possible lab leak. And then on top of that, this report drops another bombshell, a potential grand jury investigation. This feels like something straight out of a legal thriller.
This is where things get particularly intriguing. The report revealed emails suggesting that the Department of Justice had convened a grand jury to look into potential crimes connected to the pandemic's origins. They even issued a subpoena to EcoHealth Alliance, that organization we talked about earlier that was funding research at WIV.
Hold on, a grand jury. Can you break that down for me? What exactly does that mean?
A grand jury is essentially a panel of citizens who review evidence to determine if there's enough to officially charge someone with a crime. It's a process shrouded in secrecy to protect the integrity of the investigation.
Okay, that makes sense. So we've got this secret investigation potentially going on in the background. Did EcoHealth Alliance cooperate?
Interestingly, they told the House committee that they were not the target of the investigation. And to add another layer of mystery, the Department of Justice has remained tight-lipped. They haven't confirmed or denied anything related to this potential grand jury investigation.
Wow, so we're left hanging. This is already more complex than I thought it would be.
It certainly is. And it highlights how this investigation has expanded beyond just scientific curiosity. We're now stepping into the realm of potential legal accountability, with the possibility of wrongdoings coming to light.
It feels like we're just scratching the surface here. There's so much to unpack.
Absolutely. This report has opened a Pandora's box of questions, and the implications extend beyond just the pandemic itself. It raises serious questions about transparency and oversight in scientific research, especially research that could have such significant global consequences.
This is a lot to take in, and we've only just begun. There's still so much more to discuss.
Indeed, there is. We haven't even delved into the report's criticisms of the broader pandemic response yet. That's a whole other layer of this complex story.
Okay, before we get too deep into the criticisms of how the pandemic was handled, I have to ask, this whole situation has sparked a lot of debate and strong opinions. It feels like the pandemic really shook people's trust in, well, a lot of things.
You've hit on a crucial point. What we're seeing here is a multifaceted crisis of trust. It's not just about trust in science or even specific institutions. It's about trust in the information itself. We're bombarded with conflicting narratives, making it difficult to know what to believe.
And I imagine that lack of trust has some pretty serious consequences, not just for individuals, but for society as a whole.
Absolutely. When trust erodes, it becomes a breeding ground for misinformation. This can undermine public health efforts, making it even harder to respond effectively to future crises. It's a vicious cycle.
So how do we even begin to rebuild that trust? It feels like such a monumental task.
It's undoubtedly a challenge, but I believe it starts with transparency and accountability. Institutions, especially those involved in scientific research and public health, need to be open about their processes, acknowledge their mistakes, and be held responsible for their actions.
That makes a lot of sense. But isn't it also about individuals being more critical thinkers? We can't just blindly accept everything we hear, especially in today's information landscape.
You're absolutely right. We're living in an age of information overload. The ability to discern fact from fiction, to be a critical consumer of information, has never been more important.
So how do we actually do that? How do we wade through this sea of conflicting information and figure out what's true and what's not? It feels like everyone has an agenda these days.
It's about asking the right questions, considering different perspectives, and most importantly, being willing to change your mind when presented with new evidence. It's not about clinging to your beliefs no matter what.
That sounds like hard work.
It is, but it's also incredibly empowering. Critical thinking isn't just about memorizing facts. It's about understanding how to evaluate information, identify biases, and draw your own conclusions. It's about thinking for yourself.
So in a way, this whole pandemic and the debate surrounding it has been a sort of crash course in critical thinking.
I think that's a brilliant observation. We've been forced to confront our own assumptions, grapple with uncertainty, and make difficult decisions based on incomplete information. And those are skills that will serve us well beyond the pandemic.
It's definitely been a learning experience, that's for sure. Now, getting back to the report, you mentioned criticisms of the World Health Organization. Can you give us some specifics on what the report claims they did wrong?
The report really takes the WHO to task, accusing them of being too deferential to China in the early days of the outbreak and downplaying the severity of the situation. They argue that the WHO was slow to declare a public health emergency and that they initially accepted China's assurances about the virus at face value, without sufficient scrutiny.
I remember back then there was a lot of confusion about how serious this virus really was. Were there specific consequences to the WHO's alleged actions?
According to the report, those delays were critical. They argue that the WHO's hesitation allowed the virus to spread more widely, giving it a head start that made containing it much more difficult. Essentially, they're claiming that the WHO's inaction contributed to the pandemic becoming a global crisis.
Right. That's a pretty serious accusation, but I imagine the WHO has its own side of the story.
Of course, the WHO has defended its actions, maintaining that they acted on the best available information at the time and followed established protocols. They also point out that they were dealing with a novel virus and a rapidly evolving situation. It's important to consider their perspective as well.
So once again, we're faced with conflicting narratives and interpretations of events. It seems like figuring out the truth is more about understanding the nuances and complexities of the situation.
Exactly. This is where critical thinking comes into play. It's not about blindly accepting one side or the other. It's about weighing the evidence, considering the biases, and forming your own informed conclusions.
It's like being a juror in a trial, listening to all the arguments before reaching a verdict. Speaking of trials, wasn't there also some criticism of how the vaccines were approved? I seem to recall a lot of debate about that back then.
Yes, you're right. While the report praises Operation Warp Speed for its remarkable success in developing vaccines in record time, calling it a potential model for future pandemic preparedness, they do raise concerns about the FDA's approval process.
I remember hearing about some tension between speed and safety. Did the report elaborate on those concerns?
The report alleges that the FDA, possibly facing political pressure, fast-tracked full approval of one of the vaccines. Despite reservations from some scientists within the agency, it suggests that the urgency to get a vaccine out may have compromised the thoroughness of the review process.
So it's a classic dilemma, balancing the urgent need for a solution with the importance of rigorous scientific evaluation.
Precisely. And this speaks to a broader theme in the report, the challenge of making critical decisions in the face of uncertainty, particularly during a global health crisis.
It's a reminder that even the most well-intentioned actions can have unintended consequences. We can't always predict how things will unfold.
Exactly. And that brings us back to the importance of learning from our experiences.
Which is precisely what we're trying to do here today. Before we wrap up, I want to make sure we touch on the report's criticisms of lockdowns and mask mandates. This was a huge point of contention throughout the pandemic.
You're absolutely right. The report suggests that the science behind these measures was not as clear-cut as we were initially led to believe. It highlights the uncertainty surrounding their effectiveness and argues that the costs and benefits weren't always adequately considered.
I remember feeling overwhelmed by the conflicting information back then. It was hard to know what to believe.
That's a sentiment echoed by many. The report argues that this lack of clarity contributed to public skepticism and resistance. When people are asked to make significant sacrifices without a clear understanding of why, it's natural to question those directives.
So it sounds like the report is advocating for a more nuanced approach to these kinds of public health measures in the future.
Exactly. They argue for more transparency about the scientific evidence, a clear articulation of the risks and benefits, and greater consideration of the economic and social impacts of such measures. It's about finding a balance between protecting public health and respecting individual liberties.
It's a delicate balance for sure, but one that's essential to get right if we want to effectively navigate future pandemics. This report is giving us a lot to think about. It feels like we've only just scratched the surface of this report. There's so much to unpack, and it's clear that there are no easy answers.
You're right, it's incredibly complex. And it's important to remember that this report, while extensive,
Oh.
represents just one perspective on a highly debated topic.
So where do we go from here? How do we move forward with all these conflicting narratives and unanswered questions?
I think the first step is to acknowledge that there were shortcomings in our response to the pandemic. This report, regardless of whether you agree with all of its conclusions, has sparked a crucial conversation. We need to honestly examine what happened, identify the mistakes that were made, and use that knowledge to strengthen our systems and institutions.
It sounds like this report, despite all the controversy surrounding it, could actually be a catalyst for positive change. It's forcing us to confront some uncomfortable truths.
Exactly. It's pushing us to have those tough conversations about transparency, accountability, and how we can do better next time. Because let's face it, there will be a next time.
That's a sobering thought. History has shown us that pandemics are a recurring threat.
Precisely. So what can we learn from this experience? What concrete steps can we take to be better prepared for future pandemics?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Well, one clear area for improvement is our global health surveillance systems. We need to be able to detect and respond to outbreaks more quickly, ideally before they have a chance to spread widely.
That makes sense. Early detection seems crucial for containing a virus.
Absolutely. We also need to invest more in research and development, particularly in areas like vaccine development and antiviral therapies. Having effective treatments and preventative measures readily available could significantly change how we manage a pandemic.
And of course, we can't forget the importance of clear communication. We've seen how confusing and contradictory messaging can undermine trust and hinder public health efforts.
Communication is key. We need to be able to convey complex scientific information to the public in a way that is understandable, accurate, and trustworthy. We need to build that trust so people feel confident in the guidance they're receiving.
And it's not just about the information itself, it's also about how it's delivered. People need to feel heard and understood, not talked down to or dismissed.
Absolutely. We need to engage in respectful dialogue even when there are disagreements. And we need to be open to different perspectives and approaches. There's rarely a one-size-fits-all solution.
This whole experience has highlighted how interconnected we are globally. What happens in one part of the world can quickly impact the entire planet.
Exactly. We need stronger international collaboration and coordination to effectively address global health threats. Pandemics don't respect borders.
So it sounds like there's a lot of work to be done. But where does the average person fit into all of this? What can our listeners do to contribute to this effort?
That's a great question. I think one of the most important things individuals can do is stay informed. Read reputable sources of information. Educate yourself about the science of pandemics. and be aware of the potential threats.
Knowledge is power, as they say. But it's not just about knowing the facts, it's about understanding how to apply that knowledge.
Exactly. And in this case, knowledge can literally save lives. Individuals can also make a difference by taking proactive steps to protect their own health and the health of their communities. Get vaccinated, wash your hands frequently, and stay home when you're sick. These simple measures can significantly reduce the spread of disease.
And don't be afraid to speak up if you see something that's not right. If you encounter misinformation or see someone engaging in risky behavior, don't hesitate to challenge them. It's about taking personal responsibility for our collective well-being.
I couldn't agree more. We all have a role to play in preventing future pandemics.
Well, this has been quite a deep dive. We've covered a lot of ground, from the controversial claims of a lab leak to the broader criticisms of pandemic responses. It's clear that there are many lessons to be learned from this experience.
This report has opened up a Pandora's box of questions, and it's sparked a debate that's likely to continue for years to come.
But hopefully, by examining the evidence, considering different perspectives, and asking the tough questions, we can gain a better understanding of what happened and how we can prevent something like this from happening again.
It's all about learning, adapting, and evolving. We need to be willing to acknowledge our mistakes, embrace new information, and work together to create a safer and healthier future.
And to our listeners, we encourage you to continue exploring this topic on your own. Read the full House report, dig into the scientific research, and engage in thoughtful discussions about the lessons we can learn from this experience.
Because ultimately, the more informed we are, the better equipped we'll be to face the challenges that lie ahead.
Well said. We'll leave you with this final thought. With so much conflicting information out there, how can we both as individuals and as a society ensure a more effective and transparent response to future pandemics? It's a question that deserves careful consideration, and one that we all have a stake in answering. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and stay well.